Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for joining. I'm sure others will continue to join. We're right at the top of the hour. So today we're going to chat about Azure AD and Microsoft 365 security fundamentals. Do you want to forward the slide? Myself, I'm Logan Guest. I'm our sales and marketing manager, and I focus a lot on our extranet user manager product suite, as well as lots of Microsoft 365 services. So the topic that we're focusing on today, very much so prevalent in a lot of the conversations that I have with both customers and partners. Just some quick Teams meeting etiquette. This is a regular Teams meeting. Feel free to chat throughout the webinar. If you have questions, make comments. Feel free to chat. We'd like to have this as more of an open dialogue. And I know Peter likes questions. If you don't mind, please stay on mute. If you'd like to join the conversation, feel free to chat, and then we can let you come off on the mic. And then, most importantly, enjoy the content, and hopefully you learn a thing or two. Thanks.
Thanks, Logan. A little confusing here. I don't know how it's working for you, Logan, but I was getting a 1 second delay. We're actually sitting in the room next to each other right now. So we're actually out in sunny Ottawa today, doing some business meetings with some partners at Invest Ottawa, and then looking forward to attending SAS North in Ottawa tomorrow on Thursday. But my name's Peter Carson. I'm the president of Envision IT and Extranet User Manager, also an Office Apps and Services Microsoft MVP. Both Logan and my contact details are up in these slides. We're going to be posting the slides up on the event page, and we will send a follow-up note to everybody who's registered, so they've got access to that as well as to the recording that we're recording here today. Okay, so let's dive into the actual agenda. What are we going to be covering off for the next 58 minutes or so? We'll see how tight we keep it to the 1 hour mark. We've done the introductions. We're going to go into a bit of a session overview and goals around that. And then we're going to primarily be talking about the Microsoft tooling around Azure Active Directory, which has now been rebranded under the Entra brand, and the sensitivity and labeling side, which used to be compliance managers, now called Purview. Microsoft loves to rename things. So these were the new names they announced, I think, this summer at Inspire. And of course, we'll touch on licensing as well. I mean, that could be an entire talk on its own to understand how Microsoft works its licensing rules, but we'll try and give you some guidance to make sense of that thing. Okay, so let's start with our overview of the session and what our goals are for the lunch hour here. So, I mean, the key is that Azure Active Directory is the core security infrastructure. Everything you do in the Microsoft Cloud depends on Azure AD, whether you're doing things in Azure, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, you're in Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365. The common theme across all of that is Azure AD. That's how the authentication is driven, and how a lot of the authorization for most of those apps is also driven. There's different flavors of Azure AD, so we're going to talk about what are the different features of those and how those depend on different licenses. But obviously there are other parts of Microsoft that are part of that equation. The next point is maybe not something you might think of off the bat from a security point of view, is that balancing that with user experience is really key. And I'll give you some examples of that. And kind of the next point here talks to that. It's important to understand that you're applying the right security to the right sensitivity. I mean, there's a common joke to say, hey, how do I secure my computer? Well, unplug all the wires and stick it in a dark corner and it's secure because nobody can access it, but it's not very useful. User experience is zero at that point. But it's actually a real statement. You have to understand, hey, what are people trying to access and what is the appropriate security? Because if you make it too high, you're just going to block them. It'll be like that computer unplugged in the corner. People just won't be able to access it and they won't get any value from it. So getting that balance right is important. And you need to factor in not only your staff, but your external users as well. Obviously, Extranet User Manager is our product suite. This is not a product pitch session. We're very much focused on the core Microsoft functionality, but obviously we spend a lot of time thinking about external user scenarios as well as part of that. And it's absolutely something you need to think about as you're designing out your Azure Active Directory. Okay, so let's start with Microsoft Entra. So this is the new sort of security suite packaging from Microsoft. It includes Azure Active Directory, It also includes Entra Permissions Management and Entra Verified ID, which are two fairly new solutions from Microsoft that are, I would say, closely tied to Azure AD. We're not going to go into those in any sort of depth. I mean, the Entra one is quite interesting. It's basically a way to discover who has what permissions and whether they actually need those permissions or not just within the Microsoft stack, but across all your cloud infrastructure. And Entra is, how do you establish that the person that you're connecting with is who they say they are? How do you verify their identity? And that's actually a tough problem. It's not so much a cryptographic problem, it's more of a business problem of how do you actually confirm that identity. But we're going to really raise our focus in on the Azure Active Directory side of things. So there's some links throughout this deck that you'll see as we go through. And as I mentioned, we'll be providing the deck, so you'll have access to all those links once that's posted up on our site. So coming down within that Entra stack into the Azure AD side, there's actually quite a few different flavors of Azure AD itself as well. There's a free version of Azure AD. In fact, you could go to portal.azure.com and create a brand new tenant and have an Azure AD instance as part of that, and not actually have to pay a penny for that. You could invite in as many guests as you want to that, and there's no cost to that as well. And in fact, they don't even need to be guests; they could be staff members as well. There's absolutely no obligations around that. If you purchase a Microsoft service, for example, Office 365 or Microsoft 365, you're automatically going to get an Azure AD tenant as part of that. You may already have one and you're adding the 365 services to that. But if you're brand new creating your 365 tenant, part of that initiation process is it's actually going to create that Azure AD tenant for you. And then there's some security defaults that come in the free and Office 365 side. We're going to talk a lot more around multi-factor authentication and why that's important, but it enforces MFA for all users. It's actually a good thing. That's one of the biggest gaps in security in general, is not having a second factor of authentication. It also blocks what's called legacy authentication protocols. We're going to talk more about why that's important as well. And then we have Azure AD P1 and P2, which are the two premium plans. You can either buy those as standalone, or they can be bundled in with various other packaging of EMS and Microsoft 365 and such from there. So again, there's a link there that will take you into those various different plans. I tend to focus in this talk on the P1 and P2 side. I kind of see P1 as pretty much table stakes for most clients, so that you really should be thinking about using that. And the main reason for that is the ability to have conditional access policies. That is a feature of P1. You don't get that in the free or the essentials or the Office 365 side. And it's the ability to define specific rules for specific different groups of users around how you want that to work. And it's not just MFA. There's lots of things that you can control through conditional access policies. Again, we're going to dive deeper into that topic. The other points in here are awesome. We're going to talk about the Azure Information Protection on the bottom there. We'll touch on some of the other conditional access pieces in there. And then on the P2 side, basically it gets you everything that's in P1. It adds in things like identity protection, where they're looking for risk patterns, not just within your tenant, but globally, and applying rules around that. Privileged identity management, I think, is a very cool idea. It's the concept of just-in-time access. So if I'm a global administrator, but generally I don't need that always available to me, can I request it for a period of time, have that access? That's all part of privileged identity management. Access reviews is more from a governance point of view, from an offboarding point of view, and entitlement management is kind of the other side of that from an onboarding perspective. So those are all P2 features. We're not going to get into those too much as part of this session here today. So let's talk about the types of Azure AD users. At the top level, we think of them as either members or guests. There's those two user types in Azure AD, but there's a further delineation on the member side as to whether those are synced accounts or cloud-only accounts. Synced is, your organization has an on-premises Active Directory. Doesn't even need to be literally on-premises. I mean, we still have an on-prem AD at Envision IT because we still have some legacy SharePoint farms that we keep for client support point of view. I mean, we're completely platform and software as a service in the cloud, 100% in running our business. So we could be cloud-only accounts, but it's handy still to have those for us. And basically those accounts get synced from your on-premise Active Directory up into the cloud. And there's different authentication options there. You can say, hey, we're going to do what's called a password hash sync. This one you need to carefully explain to a lot of people because they get scared and they think, hey, you're taking all of our on-premises passwords and syncing them up to the cloud. Isn't that a big security risk? No, you're actually taking what's called the hashes. So the hash allows you to say, give me your password and I'll manipulate it to generate a hash. And if it matches the hash I have stored, then you're good. You entered the right password, but I can't reverse engineer that. It's a one-way hash. I can't figure out your password without you giving it to me. So it is a secure way of doing that password synchronization and allow that authentication to happen in the cloud. Pass-through authentication a little different. There's an agent you deploy on your environment. So when somebody logs into the cloud, it's actually connecting into your on-premises infrastructure to authenticate that person. It does require that that's um, solid and reliable and redundant, because if something goes down, your office internet connectivity goes down, your cloud is dead too as a result of that. Or federation, you may have been familiar with Active Directory federation services in the past. That's one example of federation. Okta, OnePass, or a number of different vendors from that perspective can do federation in there. Now on the cloud side, if the account only exists in the cloud, so there's no on-premises AD for that account, you can either use a cloud password that's stored, again, securely in Azure AD, or again, you can do the federation options there. And then the third bucket, the guests, these are people that are external to your organization. So they may be invited in if you've used the sharing features, for example, in SharePoint or Teams. You say, hey, I want to invite a guest in. That's using what's called Azure AD B2B under the hood. And you can actually do that directly through the Azure portal as well, through an Azure guest invite process. Here, there's a number of different choices for authentication. If the person you've invited in has their own Microsoft account, whether that's a personal account or a work or school account, they would use those credentials to come in. It's really nice because they don't need to create a password on your system. There's not another set of credentials for them to remember. And actually, that's true in all of these cases. You can do a similar federation with Google or Facebook. You could federate to again, Okta or external federation as part of that, or you could use what's called a one-time passcode. So if the person you're inviting in doesn't have an organizational email, you don't want to federate with Google, you just need the ability for them to sign in, but you still don't want them to remember a password. Basically what happens is when they go to sign in, Microsoft emails them a one-time passcode. It's valid for 30 minutes. As soon as they use it, it's no longer valid anymore. And that's basically their temporary password to come in. It actually works really smoothly for those use cases. So that's sort of the three different buckets that we have from a type of user point of view. So in that leftmost bucket, the on-premises account, there's a couple ways that those accounts get synced up into the cloud. Azure AD Connect is the traditional way where you install a service on your on-premises servers. Doesn't need to be on your domain controller, but it needs to be connected to your domain controller. And it basically syncs all of that on-premise AD information, not just the username and the password hash, but all the user profile and groups and everything else all come over as part of that and populates your Azure Active Directory. And it becomes, for the most part, read-only over here. It needs to be managed in your on-premises AD over here. And then users can sign in and authenticate through here and access all the cloud apps. Now, there's a simpler option, which is the Connect Cloud Sync. This one we actually use now, rather than having a bunch of server infrastructure running this Connect process, because it's fairly heavy on the server. Most of this runs in the cloud. There's just a small lightweight agent that goes on premise. It doesn't give you all the same options as the full on-premise solution, but for simpler scenarios, it's a lot easier to manage from that point of view. Okay, so we've talked about the users, how they get created, whether they're invited in, whether they're cloud only, whether they came from your on-premises Active Directory. Now we want to get into the actual authentication process, and for this we're focusing mainly on the cloud authentication. So if you're on premises, you're using a password synced hash. If you're a cloud only account, you've got credentials in the cloud from there. We're going to ignore the guests for right now. They will come into this piece, but let's just focus on your member accounts. So as each authentication request is coming in, so somebody's hitting Microsoft 365 or Teams, and it's directing them to log into microsoftonline.com for them to authenticate. They're entering a username and password, but there's a lot of signals that come as part of that process, and they all feed into the conditional access policies. So we have the ability to see, which user is logging in, but also what physical geography are they coming from, what country, what location are they coming from, what device are they using? Are they on a corporate device or is it a personal device? If it's corporate, what policies does it have applied? Or even a personal device, does it have antivirus, is it up to date? What operating system is it running? All of that information comes in as a signal here. What are they trying to do? Where are they trying to go? What application are they accessing? And then what sort of real-time risks? We think about the identity protection stuff in the Azure ADP2 that's gathering signals and saying, hey, we see this pattern that's malicious happening across tenants. We need to flag that over here into your policy and raise the risk level, and your conditional access policy can use that. But it can also use local things to say, hey, is the same user coming in from two different geographies? Well, that doesn't really make sense. People aren't in two places at the same time. Is there a valid reason for that? Or is somebody sharing their credentials, or is somebody getting hacked? That can, again, drive in from a signal point of view and influence the decision that makes the path through here. Are we going to allow access in? We're done. We don't need to do anything more. Or do we force a multi-factor authentication? So I need to get my phone out, use my authenticator app, receive an SMS code, whatever the case may be, is through there to better prove that I am who I say I am. Or do we just say, you know what, we're just blocking access. We don't care. You're doing something you shouldn't be doing. We're not going to allow you in from there. You're coming from a particular country, going to a particular application, and you're not allowed to do that. Block your access. So this is sort of the basic understanding around conditional access policies that we want to impress upon you here. Now I'm going to come back to the policy details in a minute, but what I want to do is just bring some keynotes out from Microsoft presentation at the RSA conference in 2022 back in the summer. So RSA is arguably the biggest security conference in the world once a year, and Microsoft, of course, is very involved in that. And some of the stats that they shared of what they were seeing from a behavior point of view, 900 password attacks per second. So like just a constant barrage of password attacks going on globally. And that rate is just increasing. It's double what they were seeing last year. The time that it takes to access your private data or to move laterally through your system, if you fall victim to a phishing email, or if a device is being compromised, it doesn't take long once that initial breach has happened to do something fairly nefarious from that point of view. If I go back a couple of years to their RSA 2020 talk, they, and this is just Microsoft, this is not all accounts globally, it's just Microsoft. Yes, they have billions of accounts, but 1.2 million of those were compromised in January of 2020. So a massive amount of compromises happening out there. But two key things that I'd like to impress on people here. One is that 99.9% of those accounts did not have multi-factor authentication turned on them, which makes it much easier to do things like password spray and replay attacks and just brute force try and get into those accounts. And things like password spray attacks almost always use what's called legacy authentication. And this is the authentication model that was used by your 10-year-old iOS app that you should get off of your iPhone, older applications, old versions of Outlook that can't understand MFA. Therefore, even if you enforce MFA, if you allow legacy authentication, you've left the door open to bypass it and say, hey, we're going to come in without MFA as part of that. So those two things together, close those doors, you're literally 1,000 times more secure than having left that open. So it's really important as we talk about conditional access policies. There's a lot of fine tuning that you can do in there, but we want to make sure we at least have those two things in place. So let's talk about multi-factor authentication. So there's three main methods in Azure AD to do MFA. You can bring in third-party solutions like RSA tokens and keys and things like that, but just sort of out of the box, we can do a voice phone call, we can do an SMS text code, or we can use the Authenticator app. Personally, I'm a big fan of the Authenticator app. Yeah, it's a little more complicated to get it set up because I've got to scan a QR code and enroll my device and go through maybe half a dozen steps to get that set up. But once you've gone past that, it's super easy to use. If I go to a site and it takes me to Microsoft or to the login at microsoftonline.com and that decides, hey, I need to do an MFA, then I get a toast that comes up on my iPhone saying, hey, you need to approve this. I hit approve. I do a Face ID. Actually, I think I do two, one to unlock and one to approve, and then I've done my MFA. So I didn't need to type in any codes in anywhere. I didn't do anything complicated. I just got a little buzz on my phone or on my watch, do the Face ID approval, and away to go from there. It's also more secure though. I mean, we still see reports about SIM card swaps or people doing identity impersonation and then working with the telcos to take over somebody's voice or SMS number, in which case they then control the second factor of authentication. It's obviously a more sophisticated attack, but it's definitely possible from that point of view. You know, in the authenticator, you need to have the one and only physical device that I've set it up with, and you need to be able to unlock that device as well as to provide my credentials to get to the first step from that point of view. So it's certainly more secure from that perspective. The other thing to remember in here is that every account should require MFA. There's a couple of exceptions. We're going to talk in a minute about emergency accounts and potentially guests as well. But the one that a lot of people miss is I call them service accounts. They're not really service accounts. They're user accounts that have a username and password, but some backend process that doesn't have a person behind a keyboard connected to it needs to authenticate through that. And it's storing those credentials, hopefully securely, but maybe not, depends on the application, and entering them in. And it has no way to deal with an MFA prompt. So what happens is you'll often see exclusions in conditional access policies to say all of our accounts except these, 3 or 6 or 10 accounts that are still these old legacy apps, we need to exclude them. You've left a big hole open for that as well. It's a harder hole to close because you've got to, refactor and update those applications so that they can do proper, managed identities or service principals, more modern ways of doing security for apps. But it is something you need to at least get a plan towards and say, hey, we can't just ignore that. If we can't fix it today, we need to figure out when we're going to be fixing it. So these are base conditional access recommendations. You can go way further than this. I mean, one of the things to remember though is that the more policies that you create, the more potential is that you have gaps in there, that you've actually created a hole in your policy. So try not to get them too complex because you'll probably confuse yourself and create challenges from a maintenance point of view. So I'm actually going to skip ahead for a second here to the emergency account. This is an important one to think about ahead of, which is you can, when you create these policies, put them into what's called report only mode to be safe, to say, hey, did they do what they expect them to do? Because I don't want to mess this up and suddenly lock myself out as an IT admin. You could end up in a situation where you have to open a support ticket with Microsoft, and I'm not even sure, how they deal with this. If somebody says, "Hey, I've locked all of our global admins out of our tenant, we can't get back in to fix it," how do we prove that we are who we say they are and light that up and open that up? I can't imagine that's an hour call. That's likely days or weeks to get that fixed. You don't want to be in that place. So the emergency account is your break glass, get out of jail free card to deal with that. That you always exclude your policies against the emergency account, but you put some very tight rules around how that account would ever be used because it's supposed to be obviously in an emergency situation. Two things really that you want to do. One is you can split the password across multiple people. So we can say, hey, I hold half of the password and Logan holds the other pass. And it's kind of like, those old Cold War movies where you have the two guys down in the missile silo and they have to turn the two keys, but you can't reach your arms far enough. You need two people to do it. So you can actually do the same thing literally with the passwords here. So that both of those admins need to agree, yes, this is a real use case. We need to use this emergency account. The other thing is just make sure you got notifications. So if that account is ever used, because it's never actually supposed to be used, that everybody knows about it, that it notifies everybody around that. So it's important to get that set up. So that's sort of one of the first things you want to put in there and make it part of the exclusion rules on all of your policies. The other thing that's important is if you've got domain admins in your on-premises Active Directory, don't use those domain admin accounts as your global admin accounts in your cloud account. Separate those out. So if one of those accounts get compromised, they don't have access to the entire cloud and on-premise infrastructure. It's just nice to narrow the scope of those things. Also, make sure that they're not using their regular day-to-day accounts. If I'm just logging into Teams or sending emails through Outlook, the account that I use for that should not be the privileged account that I do administration functions. That I should have a separate account that I explicitly log into around that. I already mentioned minimizing the number of policies. Blocking the legacy authentication protocols, I'll show you that. It's super easy to do, to say, hey, we're just going to close that door. And if that breaks somebody's 10-year-old app on their iPhone or their old version of Outlook that they're not supposed to be using, you might want to put it in report only mode to find those people first, but ultimately tell them, hey, sorry, you need to get off those apps. They're not secure. You shouldn't be using them anymore. And apply the policies to all the apps that are being used, and really set out 3 sets of user groups. Your administrators that are highly privileged, your regular users, and then your external guest users. So the members, everybody should have MFA turned on for that. You should actually make that more restrictive for your admins And then you need to decide, hey, for the guest users, what are we going to do on that side? And that comes back to what is it that they're doing and how sensitive is that content? How much risk is there? You may want to put a block from a geographic point of view. That's an easy one to add in as an additional from there. You can certainly go further and start to bring in device policies and other things as part of that. And I've got a link here to an article that we wrote that kind of takes you into a little more depth on those topics. So if we think about those three buckets, we have our administrators, our members, and our guests. So admins, every single time, I don't care if it's inconvenient, you're doing something highly privileged, go through MFA on every authentication. Don't allow persistence on that so that I can, if I close my browser and I open my browser up again, it doesn't keep me signed in. I have to go through a reauthentication as part of that. Make that quite strict on the admin side. On the member side, you can be more flexible. You can say, hey, don't require MFA on every authentication, X days on the same device. You can tweak that and say, hey, is it a corporate device versus a personal device? What geography, scoring, password failures in the past coming in can all drive into those rules as you get more sophisticated in there. And then guests, you have to decide, hey, first off, do we even need MFA? We do a lot of work with a partner called LMS 365. They have a learning management system built on top of Microsoft 365. When you're bringing in tens of thousands of guest users to take training, you have to say, hey, how sensitive is the content in that training? There's no personal health information or PCI data or anything like that. They're literally just taking a course. Should we require them to do MFA to get that course? Or are we going to lose half of the students because they just can't figure out how to get MFA set up on their device? So you have to make that choice and say, what are they doing? And it doesn't have to be an all or nothing. I'll show you some interesting things with sensitivity labels where you can say, if they're doing, this big bucket of things is not that sensitive, we don't need MFA. But there's this part here that's super sensitive. Maybe those people, which isn't all guests, we should require MFA from those people. And we can still go further in terms of how we balance the user experience on that side as well. So I'm going to take a pause for a sip of water here. Logan, if you could chat this link out to the group. This is a very quick 6-question poll. There's no name or email being asked as part of this, so don't worry that this is going to be used for nefarious purposes to understand which of the attendees are most likely to get hacked here. It's actually just more curiosity, and we're going to share the results of this poll towards the end of the session here. And then you can take from that yourself to say, hey, where did I fit into the general pool of people that were here today? So I will pause for a sec. So I'll let you multitask. I'm assuming lots of people have multiple monitors, and I'll actually jump into the first part of the demo piece that we want to do here, which is actually doing some walkthrough on the Azure AD portal. Now, I don't know how long people have been working in Azure on the call here. For quite a few years there, we had to deal with 2 Azure portals, and I was so happy about 3 years ago when they finally completely got all the functionality from the old portal into this new portal, and we only had 1 portal. Well, now we have 2 portals again, because you can also go to, this is just portal.azure.com. I can come to enter.microsoft.com, which is the new Entra portal, and see a lot of the same Azure AD information through here. I'm still not super used to this portal, so I may default back to the Azure portal just because I'm more comfortable over there. But if I come into things like my all users, this is literally the exact same interface that you see in the Azure portal from that point of view. They've made it a little easier to find some things. If I want to get into external identities or identity governance, it's I admit easier to find those things in the Entra portal. It's just, I kind of know where most of that stuff is over here. I just come into the general Azure portal and come into Azure Active Directory. And I can see that same user interface that we just saw for users and things like that through there. But what we want to focus on is the security side of the house. So if I come down to the bottom here to security, don't be tempted by these links here. They just take you to the documentation. The left nav is actually all the important stuff. So if we start with the conditional access, so this is where we define our policies. This is our development tenant. This is our live production tenant. And we've only got a couple of policies in here, but you'll see that we've got guests, admins, and users in there as standard policies. So those 3 buckets that we were talking about, we have a policy for each of those sets of users. We have one for the legacy protocols that applies to everybody, and I'll actually talk to this one a little bit later in the session. So let's start with the admin side. So if I come in here onto the admin side, and we look at who's included in this, the safest way to define your administrators is not to cherry pick the people who are admins, but to cherry pick the roles and say, okay, what roles do we use in our organization, like global administrator is a key one, that we want to call it that anybody that has that role, we're going to consider to be an admin, and this conditional access policy is going to apply to them. Now we can put an exclude rule on there, so we're excluding out this main account here. We're kind of treating this as the emergency account in this development tenant. And then what applications is this applying to? Everything. And then what conditions do we have on that? So we haven't applied a lot to here because we're not trying to tailor things like the MFA experience. We don't care about the sign-in risk. We're just going to say, you know what, for all modern clients, the access control is going to require MFA. So there's no question you're admin. Don't care if you're in the office, on the corporate network, whatever, you're still going to have to go through MFA as part of this authentication. And then the other thing that we've turned on here is the persistent browser session. We've actually turned off the ability to persist that. So you can't say, hey, I want to be able to close my browser and reopen it and have it come back in, logged in for me. I have to re-authenticate each time I relaunch from there. And this policy is on, but we could set it to report only if we wanted people just to see what was happening and kind of test it out before we turn it on for real. I'm not actually going to do any changes as we go through here. Then if we look at our user policy, it's predominantly the same. If we look at which user it applies to, it includes all users, but it actually excludes the guest or external users. Now, I didn't put this exclude on the administrator one because there is scenarios like maybe your managed service provider is a global admin and they use a guest account to come in to manage your tenant. You still want those high MFA policies to apply to those administrators. But here, we just want the staff in this box here. And all the same conditions are selected here, other than we haven't turned off the persistent browser session. So we do allow regular users to check the checkbox that says, hey, keep me signed in, so it's convenient when I want to come to the corporate internet tomorrow in SharePoint. I don't need to re-authenticate, it just takes me straight in. Again, you can decide the nuances of that as you go through. And then last one, if we come into the guests, actually I'm going to hold that for a little later because we have actually some variation in there that we're using some sensitivity labels for that I'm going to talk to. So that's the main pieces in here from that perspective. We're going to come back and do some more walkthrough through here, but let's pause there for a moment. Now, as I mentioned, we do a lot of focus around external users. This page is actually a really handy one to have out of the deck. We have it as an article as well, and it just takes you to a lot of different spots in Azure AD for setting up different things, particularly around guests. We're going to talk more about cross-tenant settings. This is where you would set up the federation if I want to do Google or Facebook or have my own custom federation set up in here. What do you allow from guest point of view? How does self-service work? Do you require terms of use or access reviews? Do you want to see your company branding on your Azure AD portal? I mean, we don't have time to go into all this as part of this here today, but it is important if you are bringing guests in, have a look through these settings and make sure you've got all the different things set up that you need as part of that, both from a user experience point of view and from a compliance and security point of view. Okay, so let's switch over to Purview, which is the sort of the information protection and rebranding side of things. And Purview is a big thing. I mean, this is where you get into retention policies and labels and, how long do I keep records before they get disposed of? We're not going to get into any of that. We're going to use a little sliver of it, which is called sensitivity labeling. And it's the ability to define labels that are either manually applied, or you can actually use, AI or rules to automatically apply labels to say, hey, I saw something that looks like a credit card. That must be PCI data. Or I saw a health card number or something else that looks like personal health information. I need to label it that way from that point of view. And that can influence the decisions we're going to make from an authentication point of view. So how this all ties together, they've made it a little bit confusing, but once you get your head around it, it makes sense. So we're going to focus on the SharePoint scenario because you can label either individual documents, libraries, or even an entire SharePoint site to say this content has this label on it. And the example we're going to use is we've taken an an entire site collection in SharePoint, and we've labeled it with a high sensitivity label that was created in Purview. Now, when I create that label, I can also create what's called a authentication context in Azure AD, and I can associate that context with that label. And then when I build my conditional access policies, I can say, hey, if the person is trying to access something in SharePoint that has this label on it that's associated with this authentication context, do something different from a rules point of view. This becomes part of the signals that come into the conditional access policy. I mean, I'm not entirely clear why they added this layer of abstraction in there, rather than just being able to connect these two directly with each other. I'm sure they've got some smart brains in Redmond thinking about this stuff as to why that is. You just need to understand those cross connections through there. So that authentication context, I'll show you where we set that up in Azure Active Directory. It's related to the conditional access policies, actually in the conditional access section. And then the sensitivity labels we define in Entra. So let's actually go back into the demo side of things. So let's actually start on the conditional access side. So if I come down here now, full warning, this stuff is all in preview, so it's not sort of generally available, officially supported by Microsoft. Sometimes things stay in preview for a month or two. Sometimes they can spend years in preview with Microsoft. This has been fairly recent. I think it's calendar 2022 that this all came out. So I'm not sure where it is on the roadmap for them from that point of view. So I can create a new authentication context through here, but let's have a look at what we've already got set up. So we've created this context called MFA guest sensitive SP. You can call it whatever you want, but let's have a look at what's inside there. So we can apply a description to that, and we can publish it out to apps. So there's not much that you define on the authentication context side, other than what are you calling that context. Now let's go over on to the Purview side. So if we come over here to compliance.microsoft.com and we have a look at information protection, this is where we define our sensitivity labels. We've got a number of different labels. Again, this is our dev environment. It's got some demo and test stuff in there, but it's this SP content sensitive label that we've created that's the important one for us. So if we drill into that one, we can edit that label and we can see how it's set up. There's actually a fair degree of control over what these labels mean in here. So obviously you can give it a name and a description, label color, the pretty side of it, but then let's get into the details of it. What is this label being used for? Are we going to apply it to items like individual files? Are we going to apply it to groups and sites? So here we're using it to apply it to an entire SharePoint site. Could be a team, could be a Microsoft 365 group. Or do we want to apply it to SQL data, Cosmos, or structured data from that point of view? So we're just going to use the groups and sites option in there. Now, we do have the choice if we want to, if we're applying it to items, that we can actually encrypt those items. So if somebody downloads that file, it has an encryption on it. So even if, you put it on a thumb drive and give it to somebody else, that somebody else can't do anything with it unless they have rights assigned from an information protection point of view. We're not going to get into that side of it here, but that's all part of the sensitivity labeling and the rights management service as well. But we do want to make use of it from an external sharing and a conditional access settings point of view. I mean, you can do things in external sharing to say, I'm not allowed to share content that's been marked sensitive. We're not doing that. We're actually going to embrace that scenario and say, okay, how do we make that secure through the use of conditional access policies? And we want to protect labeled SharePoint sites, and we want to connect it to that authentication context that I defined back in my conditional access policies. So I started in Azure AD, I create the authentication context, I come over into Purview, I create my sensitivity label, I connect it to that authentication context. That's sort of the second piece of the three pieces in the puzzle here. I'm going to cancel out of here because I don't want to actually save any changes in here and come back to the Azure portal. So if I come back in here and I look at my policies, let's use this top one here, which is guest accessing sensitive SharePoint. So who does this apply to? Well, we've applied it to guest users. Now, we didn't apply to everybody because we're kind of playing around with this in our dev environment. Normally, we'd probably leave this applied to all guest users. and we wouldn't exclude anybody from that point of view. So it would apply across the board to all guests. Now here we've connected up the authentication context. So we created the context, we associated the sensitivity label to it, and now we associated the context to the conditional access policy. If we come back to the diagram that we had back here, we created this first, we associated it to the label, and then we used this in the conditional access policy, and we applied the label to the SharePoint site. So there's a bunch of different things that are connected. It all fits together quite nicely once you've got it all together. So we don't have any conditions applied on that, but we do have a control in here. We say, hey, we are going to require multi-factor authentication. So if I am a guest, and if I'm accessing SharePoint content that has sensitive content in it, then I have to go through MFA as part of that. And what is my sign-in frequency? It's only for 1 hour. So I have to do a periodic reauthentication as part of that as well. So again, you can get really granular around both the experience and the security on that. So again, I'm not going to save these changes. I just wanted to walk you through what that looked like. Now, there's one more piece of the puzzle that doesn't become clear on this part here, but it's important to talk about. If we come back out to the security level in here, and I come to my external identities piece, this is a new feature that lit up this year as well from Microsoft. So I can define what's called cross-tenant access settings. If I'm working with a particular organization, how do I want that collaboration to work with this? We'll get into shared channels and teams in a minute that actually leverage this as well. But we can do things like, hey, if I'm coming from Envision IT, what are the inbound access rules in here? And we'll leave the B2B collaboration and direct connect for now. I want to come over to the trust settings. And we've set Envision IT to say, we will trust the MFA from the Envision IT tenant coming into the Envision IT dev tenant. So 2 different tenants. Basically what we're saying is don't require the Envision IT person to set up another instance on their Authenticator app. Let them use their own organizationals if their organization does it well themselves. And it actually comes over securely as part of the bearer token that comes through the authentication. So it's all trusted from that point of view. You can even trust, is the device compliant? Is there Azure AD joined on the organizational side if you're making use of that as part of your conditional access policy rules. Okay, so if we've got all that together, let's see, I am in my dev tenant right now. We've actually set this scenario up in our Extranet User Manager product. I just need to find something quick here to manage that. We're actually planning on lighting this up in our demo tenants. You'll be able to actually try it out yourself as part of that as well. Bear with me one sec. I think I left this sitting here too long. Okay, so I've got a SharePoint sensitive content group in here that's associated to this SharePoint site. If I come over here, let's go to that site. So I'm not the guest right now. I'm the owner of this site, but we can see right here, we've got a label assigned to it that it's sensitive SharePoint content. When the gear finally shows up for me here, go on Microsoft, there we go. If I go to my site information, this is actually where I set that. So this sensitive SharePoint content label that I've defined in Purview shows up in SharePoint. So I can say everything that's in this site is considered sensitive. Now, when I came into this site, I was not a guest, I was a member, so I didn't have to go through any secondary authentication as part of that. But let's come to a different browser here. Oh, we got 30 responses on our poll, that's awesome. But let me come over for a second. And what I want to do is grab this link, because I want to come in as a guest user. So if I sign into this portal, I'm signing in with my envisionit.com credentials, but I'm going into the Envision IT Dev tenant. You notice I didn't get any MFA as part of that. I'm into the site. I can browse around. I can look at these other groups that we've got, do cool things within that. But then let's say I decide, hey, I want to come down and have a look at that sensitive SharePoint content. So I click this. You can see in the bottom there, it's going to take me over to that same SharePoint site. It hit SharePoint, and SharePoint said, hey, hang on a second. You're looking at some sensitive stuff. I need you to take a step back, come back, even though you already signed in and sign in again. and I need you to go through an MFA. So I'm getting the toast on my phone here. I'm saying approve, doing my Face ID, smile at iOS, there we go. And now I'm in. The nice thing was I didn't need to set up an authenticator specific to that tenant that I'm a guest in, because it trusts my organization and it'll let me in through that. So there's a nice balance there around security and user experience that says, hey, don't do the MFA if you don't need it. If you go somewhere sensitive, enforce it, but let them use their own MFA and try and make that as good a great experience as possible for that user coming in. Okay, I think I've talked about sensitivity labels enough through there. I do want to talk for a minute up on our extranet user manager site. Actually, Logan, if you want to click or chat out the top link there as well. We've got a bunch of resources that we put up. There's articles that I've been referring as we've been going through, but we also have this Power BI Azure AD users and groups dashboard. So we've actually created a harvester application, a C# program that you can run, on your local machine. Doesn't need to be up on a server, that will harvest data from your Azure Active Directory. It won't give it to us. It'll put it into a storage account that you've set up and you control. Then we have a Power BI dashboard. This is all up in GitHub that you can download and actually see what's happening in your Azure AD tenant. It's kind of cool, actually. So let's flip over and have a look at that. So I come back to my dev tenant, different browser. Actually, the nicest way to see it is through the core product. I mean, you can use the Power BI Microsoft 365 service to publish up your report if you want to, but we actually embed it right in our product as well. So give me a second, we'll bring that up. I'm actually using our dev integration. I asked everybody to stay hands off. Hopefully we didn't break anything here. You know what, maybe I'll come back to that. I'll bring it up through the actual Power BI service for now. Oh, there we go, right there. Oh, darn. We're using Power BI embedded. I should have waited for this to come through. There we go. Because this actually starts up the embedded service. We're doing this so you don't have to license every user that's looking at the report if you're using our services as part of that. Okay, so let's have a look at what we've got in here. It's full screen, so it's a little easier to see. So this is in Power BI. If you haven't played with Power BI, it's super interactive. I can click on different elements in here to say, hey, I want to look at the groups that are part of our external user manager product, or I want to look at the native groups that are just part of Azure AD, or the whole set through there. What type of groups, what types of users, what visibility of the groups. This is a key one here. When of your users just last logged in. You see, we've got this big bucket of never logged in. These are guest accounts we've invited in for our testing purposes and development and never actually used, or people that haven't logged in 90+ days. So you can bring some governance into it and say, hey, what should we be doing with these accounts? Should we be deactivating them? Should we be deleting them? And understanding how that fits together. I can see, users by the number of groups that they belong to. So lots of details through there. I can actually see my sign-in activity. So this is using the audit logs from Azure AD, pulling them into the Power BI data model. So we can see since almost the beginning of the year, what sort of activity have we had on this tenant. And the yellow line is showing us how many failures have we had. This one was interesting. It actually just showed up. So if I come over to the sign-in failures, we'll see there's actually a huge spike in failures just a couple of days ago on, what was that, November 3rd. Arthur's actually one of our developers. He was testing some load testing of the Power BI reports. So he's building scripts to log into the portal and bring up the report. And obviously, he's doing a lot of iterations of that. Some of those logins are failing as part of that. So you can actually see those logins are spread out, across North America. So I think the load testing vendor that he uses actually spins up agents in different geographies to test out your system. It's kind of cool to see that activity coming through. So a lot of information that we can get out of this system here. This can really help when you're trying to troubleshoot. People are saying, hey, you've invited me into your portal as a guest, but I can't sign in. Well, what failure reasons are they having? What was happening with that particular user? Or is there specific user issues with individual users? Like we've got a whole boatload of users here that don't belong to any groups. We've got some that are missing emails, which you need to have for guests to work properly. And you've got some that have an invitation that's never been accepted. And if people were invited years ago, back when you had to accept the Microsoft invitation, their account will be locked. They won't be able to log in. There's some PowerShell. We've got an article, I think, on that topic of how do you clean that up and what does that look like. So lots of cool stuff. This is all available in GitHub. We've open sourced the Power BI report. We've open sourced the data harvester. So go ahead and pop over to our Extranet User Manager site. You'll come to this Azure AD B2B resources. You can pull all that down. There's a full technical guide. I'm happy to help if folks want to walk through and guidance on that. Our team's on standby to be able to help out with that. So under the hood, what it's doing is we've got this console app here that we've written, and we've actually published not just the executable, but all the source code behind that. It basically pulls data from Azure AD, puts it in Azure table storage that the Power BI can use. And then you also set up your diagnostic settings in Azure AD to send all of the login sign-in activity into blob storage, and we can pull that also into the data model. Okay, I'm just going to have a quick look at what are my main topics that I've got left here. So really just the B2B health, external users and teams, and licensing. So we've got about 10 minutes left. We're doing pretty well. So I touched on some of these things from a B2B health point of view. I mean, this is initially why we created that Power BI dashboard, is to look for those scenarios. Like, users that have been around for more than 8 years didn't have B2B concept in Microsoft Azure AD, they may not have a user type populated. And if your conditional access policies are trying to decide, do I take this path or that path, depending on the user type, you want to make sure that user type is fully populated. A mismatch between an email and a user principal name, this is kind of your sign-in name. Some organizations do this because they feel it's more secure. I feel it's less convenient, which causes a lot of confusion, where what their email address is not what they sign into Microsoft login, and that can cause people to go down the wrong path through there. Obviously, you need an email if you're going to do B2B. So if any of your staff don't have an email filled in their Azure AD records, they're not going to be able to be invited to other tenants to collaborate from that point of view. This one here is an interesting one. We've got a couple of these where there's been broken or misconfigured Azure AD tenants. In one case, there was a major Canadian utility company had gone down the Microsoft 365 path a little bit and then decided, hey, we're going to switch directions. We're going to use G Suite, and they kind of abandoned the Microsoft 365 side. But they left that Azure AD tenant there, still connected to their email domain, and it just made a mess of things when you're trying to invite people in. So we had to clear that tenant out. We had other ones where they'd sort of started setting up Azure AD, but they hadn't set it up for the organization as a whole. And when you try and invite those people in, again, you get issues from that perspective. The unaccepted invitations, I mentioned, there's some cleanup you can do around that. This one here still drives me crazy because I have a peter@envisionit.com mailbox for my Microsoft 365 corporate account, but I also have the same from a 15-year-old at least Microsoft account that I created personally. You can't do that anymore. Microsoft doesn't let you create custom domains for your Microsoft accounts, but the legacy ones are still there, and it just causes a lot of confusion on the sign-in because it always brings up that, do you mean your work account or your personal account? And sometimes it just plain doesn't work. So themes to think about in terms of cleaning up your own tenant or problems you may encounter with other tenants that you're trying to bring in as guests through there. Now, the reason I've called out external users and teams specifically is that they're a little bit different. They're the first one that's using what's called Azure AD Direct Connect. So there's two ways to bring external users into teams. You can invite them in as a B2B guest, just like you do in SharePoint, and that's fine. They're part of the team. The problem is when they want to see that team, they have to do what's called a tenant switch. They have to flip their Teams app away from their organization and point it at your tenant. And they lose all their activity feed and everything that's happening in their organization. They only see what's happening on your side. When they flip back, they lose sight to everything on your side. So it's really not an effective way to work. I generally recommend people don't do the guest route because of that. The last couple of months, they brought out what they call Teams Connect. This was announced about 2.5 years ago. It took a long time to get across the finish line and rolled out. It's still officially in public preview. It's not in general availability, but it's a really cool feature. Basically, you need to turn it on both tenant sides. So it's more of an organization to organization rather than person to person type of sharing. But what it means is that there's no tenant switching. I see those shared channels from the other tenant right in my Teams feed along with all my other teams. It shows up in my activity feed. I don't need to switch my tenant. So now it becomes effective. I get the shared notifications across both tenants or however many tenants I may be part of, and much more useful from that point of view. So we actually have an article here on how we use Teams shared channels. I put this slide together just to kind of explain the difference between a private channel in Teams and a shared channel in Teams. So a private channel always has to be a subset of the team that it belongs to. So let's say there's 100 people in this team. You could have 199 or all 100 people in the private channel, but you can't have anybody who's not in the containing team. Shared channels are different. They can include any subset of the people that are in the team, but they can also include people that are not in the parent team. In fact, they can even include other teams as members. And if I add somebody new to this team, they become a member of this shared channel. We actually use this at Envision IT for our partner shared channel. So we'll create a partner shared channel in our main partner team. We'll make our internal operations team that all of our staff members belong to uh, a member in there so everybody can see that, and then we'll invite in the individual partner accounts into that shared channel. And everybody gets to see it. Everyone sees it in their own feed. It works really well from that point of view. And that B2B Direct Connect, I'm running a little tight on time, but that was back here. If we come back into the Azure portal, it's actually right in this same spot here. So this is where you define your inbound and your outbound rules for B2B Connect. Am I allowed to connect to this tenant? Or are they allowed to connect to me? So it's something you have to set up on both sides from that. And again, you can get quite granular in those rules, not just at the tenant level, but down to the individual user or group level as well. So a lot of stuff I talked about here has a licensing impact to it. Which of these different features do you have available to you, and they obviously have different costs associated with that. It's super confusing, like that sensitivity label that I was talking about. This is the couple of paragraphs out of the 50-page license document from Microsoft that describes what you need for that particular feature, and it just kind of goes on from there. So if you're getting lost in the weeds on the licensing, this is a bookmark you want to keep, which is M365 Maps. This is a full-time Microsoft employee who kind of as a side thing has a GitHub project to create out these views of license maps, and they're super useful. So if I come over here, so this is his m365maps.com, and let's say E3 was the main thing that we were working with, so I could look at 365 Enterprise E3, and I can start to see what's in the Office 365 E3. I get all of these features. And if I buy Microsoft 365 E3, I get the Office plus the EMS plus the Windows features. But maybe I just want the Office 365. I'm going to add in Azure AD P1, or maybe I'm going to up it to EMS E3 and get these here. So you can see how it sort of simplifies that complex matrix relationship between all the product suites from Microsoft. So it's a great tool to navigate through that. I did want to take a minute, because we've only got 3 left here, to talk about the forms results. So let's just flip back to my Microsoft Forms page and have a look at our responses here, and we can talk quick through that. So almost everybody uses Microsoft 365. That was kind of a silly question, so that's fair. Pretty even split here between the Office 365 Azure AD licensing, the P1, and the P2. A few folks not sure, that's fine. But that's interesting to see. So more than half have either P1 or P2, which is great to see from that point of view. This one here, do you enforce MFA? Hopefully I'd gotten to this point in the talk that it's not just, is it 100% of the users? And that's great to see that, hey, 61% of the organizations, 100% of their people have to go through MFA. That's awesome, because that's what we want to see. That's where everybody should strive towards getting to. And how do you implement that? Do you use conditional access policies that we've been talking about? Do you use the security defaults because you don't have P1 or P2? Is there a third party? You're not quite sure on that side. I actually didn't show you this rule here. It's a super simple one to look at to block that legacy authentication, either through security defaults or conditional access policies. If you're not sure, ask your IT admin staff around that. So, generally pretty good from that point of view. So, gauge yourself personally as to how you answered and how you compared to to the group as a whole and where you stand from that point of view. The other thing I just wanted to briefly mention, there's a lot of confusion from people that they think that all of these features I have to license my external users for as well. You don't. Your external users are covered. Basically, your first 50,000 monthly active users, which is a big number, get whatever your staff have. So if they have P1, your externals get P1. If you have P2, your externals get P2 as part of that. And even if you go beyond that, it's quite price competitive from that point of view. Last thing, just remember what external users are. They literally have to be people that are not part of your organization. You know, you can't say, hey, my shop floor staff don't work on a computer, but I still want to get access to some things. That's not an external user. That's they call it an F1 or F3 frontline worker license that you do need to buy for that. I didn't actually take a breath here. I'm not sure, Logan, whether we had questions that we want to address through here. Or we're actually at the 1 o'clock mark. I should probably wrap it up there. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us here. As I mentioned, we're going to be uploading the deck. We'll be uploading the recording, so you'll have access to that. And have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.